Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the LEA Special Education Point of Contact Monthly Webinar for January. We will begin momentarily. We do see that some attendees are still logging in and connecting to audio to hear this presentation. For those of you who are already logged on, please feel free to check out a copy of today's presentation that you can download here through GoToWebinar. If you expand the handouts menu, you will see a PDF format of this presentation today. And feel free to follow along with us as we go through the slides today. We do have a full presentation for you this morning. And we will get started in about a minute or so because I do see that, again, some people are still logging on. Feel free to let us know in the questions box if you're not able to download the presentation. And we'll be getting started shortly. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Tiffany Ingram, and I would like to welcome you to the LEA Special Education Point of Contact Monthly Webinar for January 2021. We have several teams here that work collaboratively to put together this webinar for you on a monthly basis, and we will hear from several speakers from the Division of K-12 Systems and Support, our Chief Information Officer, as well as our Teaching and Learning team. And again, for those of you who have just joined us, you will be able to download a copy of the presentation in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel. You will see PDF version of the presentation to follow along with today. So this is our agenda for today. I've already introduced myself. We'll go through our policy reminders and updates. We'll go through some non-public updates, transportation updates, as well as some announcements and reminders from our teaching and learning team. And I will pass it over to Christy to share about our policy reminders and updates.
Good morning, everyone. This is Christy Weaver-Harris. I'm the Policy Manager in OSSE's Division of K-12 Systems and Supports. I have a couple of quick reminders to go over today. On December 22nd, OSSE released a model child find poster for LEAs to use within school buildings to support public awareness efforts related to your child find obligations. We realize most LEAs and schools are still operating in a remote posture, and even if you are open, you limited public access to buildings. But we wanted to make this available to you for future planning. The poster is fillable when you download it from our website, so you can put in the appropriate contact information for your schools. And you can download it from our website where we have all of our child find resources, and the link is on this slide. Next slide, please. Since the start of the public health emergency, OSSE has released a series of IDEA Part B FAQs. On July 21st, we issued the first consolidated and comprehensive guidebook for the start of the school year, where previously issued guidance related to the implementation of IDEA Part B was consolidated throughout, and it's organized to be consistent with the special education process. So this document was updated on December 15th to include more information that was necessary to provide guidance based on your feedback and some questions that we've received in the interim related to conducting in-person activities, completing initial evaluations and reevaluations, including completing assessments and conducting virtual meetings. Next slide, please. This document also has some information on LEA child find obligations, truancy and enrollment, student discipline, and the use of LEA provided technology and devices for non-educational Medicaid reimbursable medical services. I want to go over some of this guidance specifically as it relates to completing assessments and evaluations. Next slide, please. During periods of remote or hybrid learning, LEAs may establish their own policies for conducting in-person activities, including processes for conducting evaluations or assessments or conducting statewide park assessments. Those policies should be tailored to meet the needs of your LEA, your school building, your staff, and your students. In developing and carrying out those policies, LEAs are going to have to balance health and safety considerations with student educational needs. LEAs need to be following health and safety guidelines and restrictions established by the mayor and by DC Health. And OSSE's Division of Health and Wellness also has a lot of resources and guidance about operating during COVID, which you can find on our COVID specific website that's linked at the bottom of this slide. Next slide, please. So we know LEAs are facing significant challenges completing evaluations and especially conducting student assessments as part of those evaluations. Evaluation activities that don't require in-person assessments should continue in a timely manner with the consent of the parent and as long as the parent makes the child available to do so. In considering whether an assessment can or must be provided in person, LEAs are required by IDEA to ensure that evaluation measures and assessments are reliable and valid, that they are administered by trained personnel, and that they're administered in accordance with the instructions provided by the assessment creator. Now, we know that some assessments simply have not been normed or validated for remote administration. And you need to consider whether you can ensure the appropriate environment for remote administration. A student may not be able to secure the appropriate physical environment to do the assessment remotely, or it may not be possible for the student to access the required technology. But if there is technology that's required for an assessment, your LEA should be providing access to that technology. Next slide, please. As part of an initial evaluation or reevaluation during the review of existing data, the LEA and group of persons knowledgeable about the child may determine that there is sufficient existing data upon which to make a determination and that no additional assessments are necessary. We talk a lot about this over the last couple of years, especially as it relates to reevaluations, about relying on the data that you already have available to you. But the data and information that you're going to use in that review of existing data must be timely and relevant. So you need to make sure that the student has recent data that is also relevant for your purposes. We encourage you to ensure that a student has recent assessment data reflective of their current performance and to not use, like, for example, like 8-year-old assessment data or 8-year-old evaluation data. If the IEP team determines that sufficient data does not exist and that additional assessments are necessary, that's when you're going to have to consider conducting remote or virtual assessments if possible, in consideration of the factors that I previously discussed. And also consider the necessity and feasibility of conducting in-person assessments in accordance with your LEA's existing reopening plans. Next slide, please. So we also want to do a quick reminder of requirements related to reevaluations. A reevaluation is any evaluation conducted after the initial evaluation and can serve many purposes other than just determining the continued eligibility of a child. If a child's needs have changed, the IEP team should consider whether a reevaluation is necessary to inform the child's continued receipt of services and the design of their IEP. So you may need to be conducting a reevaluation to determine the present levels for the student, to determine the student's needs, to consider what additional modifications or additions to the IEP might be necessary. So there's a lot of other reasons to be conducting a reevaluation other than just either determining whether the child is still eligible or, oh, it's been 3 years and we're required to at this point. Next slide, please. Some basic requirements related to reevaluations. So LEAs are required to ensure a reevaluation occurs at least once every 3 years or more frequently if conditions warrant, like I was just speaking to on the previous slide. If a student's needs change, you're also required to ensure that a reevaluation occurs, The LEA must also conduct a reevaluation if a parent or a teacher requests it and or before determining that a child is no longer eligible, unless that child's eligibility is terminating because they're graduating with a diploma or they are aging out. Aside from the requirement to conduct a reevaluation every 3 years, there aren't any specific state level timelines associated with reevaluation. LEAs may have internal timeline requirements, and we know that many do. I generally recommend that you follow the same or similar timeline as you do for initial evaluation. So I would recommend that you try to complete assessments and make an eligibility determination within 60 days of obtaining parental consent for that reevaluation. That seems reasonable to me, but it is not specifically required by district regulations or policy. That is just my own personal guidance. LEAs are not required to obtain parental consent before reviewing existing data to determine if additional data or assessments are needed. However, if the IEP team determines that sufficient data does exist, the LEA must obtain parental consent before making an evaluation determination based on that data. And if the parent doesn't respond to requests for consent, the LEA may proceed with a reevaluation if you can show that you made reasonable efforts to obtain that consent. And if the parent refuses to provide consent, that is an active refusal to provide consent, the LEA may pursue a reevaluation through due process or through mediation. Next slide, please. Evaluations are required to draw from a variety of sources, including both formal and informal data. This can include observations, interviews, and other techniques or procedures determined appropriate by the IEP team, or really during an evaluation, it's the group of persons knowledgeable about the child. It's not always specifically just the IEP team members and others who are conducting the evaluation. Student observations are very difficult to complete right now. They're not necessarily required as part of an evaluation or initial evaluation or a reevaluation unless you're determining eligibility for specific learning disability as required by IDEA. And we address this in question 39 on page 18 of the guidance. In consideration of the difficulties associated with conducting formal assessments and obtaining standardized evaluation data during the public health emergency during COVID right now, LEAs and IEP teams are reminded of the flexibilities that are available to you. If anyone has tips or effective practices that you've found that have been successful for you during this period of time while you've been conducting assessments, trying to complete evaluations, please feel free to put those in the questions box or in the chat box, and I'll share them at the end of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Christy.
I've seen a couple of questions come through while I've been talking. I'm going to triage through those and I will address them at the end of the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And in addition, if you are able to drop possibly the link to where people can go to the guidance that you've referenced for COVID that was recently released, that would be great too, Christy. I didn't add it to the presentation.
Sure, I'll drop that in the chat box.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
We will now turn it over to Sharon to share some updates from our non-public team.
Thank you, Tiffany. Good morning, everyone. This is Sharon Powell, Education Program Specialist with the Office of Special Populations and Programs, which falls under the Division of Systems and Supports K through 12. Next slide, please. So through this first slide, we'd like to share with you the non-public monitoring team's on-site monitoring schedule for this school year, which you can see started in mid-January and will continue through the beginning of April. These are the non-public schools, both day and residential, that we will be visiting virtually. So as many of you know, on-site monitoring looks a little different this year due to COVID-19 and the state of emergencies that have been declared and are in place in jurisdictions across the country. At this point, we will not be traveling to schools and conducting in-person interviews, school tours, and classroom observations. Rather, we will be conducting these activities remotely through a virtual online platform. We will be conducting that in-person on-site component within 45 days of the end of the public health emergencies. So if your LEA is an LEA that has a student or students placed at one of these schools, please know that we will be completing a monitoring review on the date or date shown here, and that review may include interviewing one or more of your students. If you have any information that you think may be relevant to this review, please contact me. My email address, I believe, will be provided at the end of this presentation. In case not, it's sharon.powell@dc.gov. Next slide, please. Okay, so with this slide, we would like to remind LEAs that the DCMR, the District of Columbia Municipal Regulations, require non-public schools to make certain types of information available to OSSE. In 2018, OSSE developed an online application within QuickBase called the Incident Report module to enable non-public schools to submit incident reports directly to OSSE. These reports are to be submitted within 1 business day of an incident occurring. When these incident reports are uploaded to QuickBase by the non-public school, a copy of that report is automatically sent to the sending LEA. It's OSSE's expectation that LEAs are reviewing these incident reports to obtain information needed for effectively monitoring the progress and safety of the students who are placed in non-public schools. So students who are placed in more restrictive settings, sometimes located outside of DC and jurisdictions that may be many miles from the student's home and neighborhood school. Next slide, please. And you may be asking which types of incidents non-public schools are required to report to OSSE. The DCMR requires non-public schools and programs to report all incidents involving a DC student and the use of an emergency behavioral intervention. So any kind of restraint, including those mentioned here, or seclusion. Please note that some restraints are prohibited under all circumstances, including one of those mentioned here on this slide, the mechanical restraints, and some may be used only under very specific circumstances that are outlined in the DCMR. In addition, non-public schools and programs are required to report all cases of suspected child abuse or neglect, any incident resulting in physical injury, and any incident that can be defined as an emergency. So typically an incident that would require the involvement of emergency responders, such as EMTs, police, or fire department personnel. Please note that these reporting requirements continue to be in effect regardless of whether students are engaged in in-person or distance learning. Yep, I think so. I think that's it. And I think that was the last slide for the non-public update.
Yes, it was, Sharon. Thank you so much. And for those of our attendees online, if you have any questions, I know that both Christy and Sharon shared a great amount of information. If you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and our team will work through to answer your team's questions as quickly as we can. If we aren't able to do it during this webinar, we will definitely follow up with you at the conclusion to make sure that your question is answered. Thank you so much, Sharon, for
Absolutely. Thanks.
sharing the non-public updates.
Sure.
We will now transition to Doug with our transportation team to provide updates in the world of transportation.
Good morning. Thank you, Tiffany. This is Douglas Johnson speaking on behalf of OSSE DOT. I want to say good morning, everyone. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday. And you could go ahead to the next slide for me. All right. So we sent out a couple of months ago the bus safety kit just to inform all schools of what OSSE DOT will be doing to ensure that our staff is safe and also your students are safe. So if you haven't received the bus safety kit documentation via email, please reach out to the data team, or you can just give a call to the TOTE support line and we'll reach out to you and ensure you to receive one via email. The bus safety kit will cover student and staff safety. It will also inform parents, school, and stakeholders of what DOT is utilizing internally and externally resources to ensure all stakeholders are educated and informed on division, agency, local, and federal information as we navigate through the new normal. So whatever, with government regulations, everything that has to go on, that will be included within the bus safety kit. So if you haven't received that, please reach out. We'll send it to you. And also there's a link. If you download the presentation, you can see the OSSE DOT guide to reopening video there. Next slide, please. And currently, if your school is practicing distance learning and you're planning to start school within February or March or even April sometime, we are requiring you, when you're creating a calendar in the system, to add an in-person start date. That in-person start date will assist us with bringing back our staff as we need to, and also it will let us forecast how many students that we can project to see that we may be transporting when it comes to the later months that are coming up. So if you don't have an in-person start date yet, please talk to the higher ups in your school. If they're deciding on sometime soon to do a hybrid type of cohorts with the students, we would definitely need an in-person start date. And also reach out to us at the TOTE support line or via email at data at dot.data@dc.gov to inform us of your start date when you all may be planning to have students into your school. It's very important you do that with like 30 days out prior to the date, because you'll need to submit a transportation request for those students in order to have them be ready in time for their start date for transportation. And if you are at a non-public and you're planning to restart school or planning to have in-person schooling for the first time, please reach out to the LEAs that you have students coming from to inform them of that you have submitted a calendar in the system, and also that what cohort that student is a part of. That's important for when they're submitting the transportation request. Next slide, please. And finally, if you haven't attended any TOTE refreshers or haven't have TOTE training, and you may have a new coordinator at your school, these are the dates that we have for TOTE training: February the 3rd, the 17th, March the 3rd, and March the 17th as well. So you can sign up for those dates, and we'll have the training on those days. And if you have a person that may get transferred from another position, or they're new to that transportation position at your school and they need training immediately, you can reach out to us and we can schedule a one-on-one session as well with that person, so they can assist with submitting the transportation request forms in the system. That's all the information that I have today, Tiffany. I want to thank you all again. If you have any questions, please utilize the resources to reach back out to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. And Doug and Wesley from our transportation team are here on the line. So if you have any questions after these slides right now, you feel free to place them in the chat, as I do know many of our LEAs are thinking about at least going into a hybrid model very soon. So please make sure you have any questions about transportation. Please make sure you type them in our question box to be answered for you. I now want to transition to Jen from our Office of Teaching and Learning to share about some reminders and announcements that we have here from our Teaching and Learning team. Jennifer.
Thank you, Tiffany. You can go ahead and advance to the next slide. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jen Carpenter, and I provide professional development around special education topics, among other things. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about some upcoming professional learning opportunities and resources, and also for some new work that we will be undertaking as an extension of our work to improve outcomes for students with disabilities across the city. I would really appreciate it if you would share the opportunities that I'm going to be speaking about with relevant staff members in your LEA and school campuses. And I would also tell you that if there are opportunities that you see listed here that you would like to maybe use as part of LEA-wide or school-wide professional development opportunities, you can always use the slide at the end of this presentation. You can find my email address there. You can contact me and we can find some ways to customize professional development for your school or LEA. Next slide, please, Tiffany. Thank you. So our winter and spring PD catalog for teaching and learning was released on December 17th. I include the date there so that you can look in your email if you do receive our TAL bulletin and pull that up and find it, but you can also use the links provided here. So we have a pretty robust menu of virtual PD sessions and series. I am repeating the online course version of the Using Data to Develop High Quality IEPs series. It's been a really great experience working with teachers and special education coordinators and directors across the city on this series, and it's really been developed over time in partnership with you and with the teachers that you work with every day. And in its current form, it's offered online as a 6-week course. It did start on Monday, but if you have folks in your LEA or your school buildings that you feel would benefit from a 6-week course that would earn them 24 PLUs, it's basically a micro credential, but it's not, to improve their IEP development practices, please do reach out to me or use the registration link provided. I am allowing folks to join a little late, but I would hope that they would hop on board soon, because we will have a live webinar this afternoon, but we can always get people caught up. At the same time, I've started a completely asynchronous using high leverage practices to improve outcomes for all students 4-part online course, and that does not include live webinars. It's self-paced, and it includes both series include some opportunities to apply what you've learned and upload it to the online course so that we can ensure that you have understood all of the new content that we have provided for you, and there are opportunities through discussion boards to have conversations to enrich your thinking about these things. There are a lot of other PD sessions offered by Teaching and Learning, from restorative justice, SEL, STEM, ELA, math, supporting English learners, dual language learning, culturally responsive instruction, and more. I do really encourage you to check out our ELA, math, and STEM professional learning sessions. The content team has worked very hard to embed high leverage practices for students with disabilities into all of the training that they are offering this spring. It has been a goal of Teaching and Learning to ensure that all teachers are being supported to serve students with disabilities. And so as part of that, my colleagues in the content areas have worked very hard to ensure that they have learned more about high leverage practices and that they have integrated them fully into their professional development offerings. So please do check out the catalog. Next slide, please. So I'd like to give you also some updates on OSSE's special education strategic priority. I'm going to right now drop a link in the chat. It's to the Students with Disabilities landscape analysis. And you can check that out later, but if you haven't already, many of you I know have. But as a state education agency, we committed in our current strategic plan to accelerate academic outcomes for students with disabilities. Next slide, please. As part of this work, we conducted a landscape analysis to describe and establish a shared understanding about the scope and the scale, and even the barriers and reasons behind the challenges faced by students with disabilities being served in the district. We shared the findings, which I have just linked for you in the chat, across a broad group of stakeholders and gathered feedback and worked with them to come up with recommendations for citywide action. We agreed entirely as a group that We are not going to fix what's broken in special education from within special education, but it will take an all hands on deck approach. And we have committed to some immediate actions and some long-term investments that we can drive and that we can work with our stakeholders across the city to drive moving forward. Next slide, please. So this is just a representation of this process starting in FY19. We conducted that landscape analysis. We came up with some recommendations for action. We worked with LEA leaders across the city, parents, teachers, school leaders, advocacy groups, to develop an agenda. Oh, educator preparation programs, the list does go on, but I won't. To come up with some OSSE-led strategies and to begin implementing citywide, which is where we are now. Next slide, please. So we have some great news. Using the very rich but frankly depressing data that you will find in the special education landscape analysis, we applied for a special education personnel development grant, and we received one from Department of Ed, Office of, OSSE, in the amount of $3 million over 5 years. It's going to help us to carry out our special education priority work in depth and at scale. And so we are partnered with Swift Education Center to carry out this work, and I'm going to describe it for you here. But the goals are to build our own capacity and the capacity of LEA teams to support schools to implement MTSS for all students. We are working with Swift to develop an inclusive leader cohort for school leaders to deepen their knowledge around supporting inclusive practices for students with disabilities, including things like establishing and evaluating evidence-based practices in their LEAs, supporting continuous improvement processes at the student, classroom, and school-wide level, linking professional development offered in school to active implementation, so on and so forth. We are providing choice-based PD for educators through an LMS that we are in the process of procuring right now to offer you more streamlined ways to access our training. I know that our move to virtual training has not been without hiccups, but we are on the way to a smoother system. Probably excites me more than everybody else. We will be creating family training resources that are companion resources for the trainings that we will be offering to LEA staff, so that we are empowering families with common language and understanding, shared understanding, so that they can be more engaged and full partners of IEP teams. We're creating communities of practice and using those to disseminate best practices and resources to educators and their families. Next slide, please. This is a sample of the sort of professional development that we'll be offering and the framework that we are using. This is for the first implementation year. We will have leader-focused, teacher-focused, and family-focused materials. You will have this slide to look at in detail, but I just want to note that we will continue providing support around IEP development. We will be adding support around staffing and scheduling to support service in the least restrictive environment. I have heard from many people on this webinar right now and from staff members across the city that sometimes the challenge to high quality IEP implementation is really bounded by the challenges faced in staffing and scheduling. So we'll be providing some support there through our partnership with Swift. Our school climate team will be digging deep into fostering a culturally responsive and inclusive school climate and ensuring that school climate school-wide and classroom-wide systems and supports are not separate and different from the individual supports we provide students with disabilities. And then finally, and this is already underway, we'll be providing integrated and evidence-based instruction support to ensure that high leverage practices for students with disabilities are integrated into the trainings for in all content areas and all special populations, and that we have leader materials that will help leaders build capacity to evaluate and provide support for evidence-based instructional practices that lead to improved outcomes for all students. Next slide, please. This is just an example of our timeline. Right now, we're working on building our own capacity and getting that LMS installed so that we'll have more efficient, accessible, and more integrated opportunities for professional development that will be easier for folks to sign up for, easier to access, and then easier to get to submit evidence of their understanding and to get those professional learning units. We're also working to transition ourselves to an MTSS framework. Moving forward, we'll start working with DCPS Central Office, and from there, we will start working with partner charter LEA sites on the same sort of capacity building we're doing for ourselves right now. As this capacity building work continues, we will launch new inclusive leader cohorts each year. Those inclusive leader cohorts can engage their school teams in professional development. It's also open to all educators. We will be launching micro-credentials on topics of interest to LEAs across the city, and we will begin offering family resources through the Family Resource Center. All along the way, we will be refining and implementing our measurement tools so that we are practicing continuous improvement ourselves, ensuring that we are always working a little bit harder to do a better job of providing you with the support that you need. Next slide, please. One thing that I would like to note is that we have moved to a different secondary transition training model. The old nuts and bolts, may it rest in peace, has been retired, and we have a training series, Secondary Transition 101, which integrates and builds upon the nuts and bolts training, the transition planning for middle school students, and then really addresses some of the challenges of secondary transition service, assessment, and implementation through the virtual learning space. It's offered by our partners at School Talk, and it's going to be offered twice this spring, winter and spring. If you would please use the links on the slides that you'll receive to register. We'd love to see you sign up. For some reason, it was not in the catalog, and so this is your I guess addendum to the catalog that you can use to sign up for these sessions. If for some reason you'd like to pick up with the first offering and start with session 2, I don't think it would hurt anyone to do 2, 3, and 4 and then circle back to session 1 at the end, because I do know that Chelsea does an excellent job of reviewing the legal and theoretical background at the beginning of every session to make sure that everybody understands why we do the evidence-based practices that we do. Next slide, please. There are additional PD opportunities, and you can hear about them all by signing up for the TAL PD Bulletin. We hope that you will do that and subscribe, and you can use the link on the slide here to find the most recent TAL PD Bulletin. Okay, are there questions in the question box that are for me, Tiffany?
We will get to check questions in just a second.
Okay.
There may be, I have to check and see.
Okay.
But I do want to remind people that if they've missed last month's webinar, this is the link for our website to check out any previous webinar sessions that you may have missed, to download those training and resource materials. For people who may have questions about anything that was shared in the presentation today, this is a great opportunity to put that in the question box now, in the chat box, so we can reach out to you. I know that there are so many questions that have been asked during this presentation. I don't see anything for you right now, Jen, but I do want to pass it to Christy to see if there are any questions that I think you've done a great job of answering people's personal questions, but if there are any clarification or kind of updates that may help the entire group, feel free to share with us.
Sure, there's some questions that I think would be helpful for the whole group. We got a question around the process if the IEP team determines that they do not have sufficient data during the review of existing data or the analysis of existing data, or what some people call the AED. So if the IEP team determines that they do not have sufficient existing data during the review of existing data, that is when you have to consider what additional assessments are necessary and whether those assessments can be conducted remotely or in person. And just a general reminder that the RTI process can't be used to delay or deny an initial evaluation. So if you're like, oh, we don't have enough data to make this decision, but if we implemented this intervention first, maybe we'd be able to tell more, that could be unnecessarily delaying an initial evaluation or a reevaluation. So make sure that you are using the information that you gather from the RTI process to inform your review of existing data, but that you're not delaying initial evaluations to like put things on hold so you can do some more RTI and get some more data. But we are happy to provide additional guidance on that on like a case-by-case basis. So if you have further questions, please reach out to either me or your IDEA monitor. We got a question around parental consent, especially during COVID, and whether consent can be oral versus written. So consent as it is defined in the DCMR is required to be in writing, and that is defined in 5E DCMR like 3000 or 3001. I think it's 3001. But consent, like I said, is required to be in writing. So in the COVID guidance that I have linked to in the chat, we address this in question 4 on page 7. We do recognize that right now it's really difficult to get parent signatures. And basically we are encouraging you to get them however you can and to document them however you can. But if you are obtaining a parent signature in a somewhat unconventional way, so if the parent is emailing you a scanned copy of something, of their signature, or they're taking a picture of their signature on the form and sending it to you, we do encourage you to like confirm receipt of that consent and the impact of that consent through a PWN. So say you get a picture of a parent's consent on the consent form, you want to upload that into the student's record in SEDS and then issue a PWN saying the parent has consented to the initial evaluation, we will now be conducting yada, whatever assessments, or we will be moving forward with a meeting. So make sure that you're documenting both the receipt of that consent and also the effect of that consent for the parent. If a parent refuses consent for a reevaluation, can you then, like, what should you do with the student in the meantime? So if you are required to obtain consent for a reevaluation at any point in time, so whether it's the triennial reevaluation or if you are determining that a child is no longer eligible, so say that it's time for the triennial, the parent says, no, I don't want to do a reevaluation. In order to determine that the child is no longer eligible, you would also have to be conducting a reevaluation. So if the parent refuses consent, you do have to pursue the reevaluation through you may pursue it through due process or mediation. In the meantime, I would encourage you to consider providing IEP services. This is also a related kind of misconception, is that we refer to IEPs as having expired, especially in our IEP implementation for transfer students policy. Although the date on an IEP may expire, you're still required to continue to provide services on that IEP even after it expires, because the student's eligibility remains and the student remains entitled to certain services. So in this instance, if a parent refuses to provide consent, I would encourage you to continue to provide services for those students. We also got a question about, this is somewhat unrelated to reevaluations, but if a student receives a certificate of IEP completion, does their eligibility terminate? And the answer here is no. A student who graduates with or who receives a certificate of IEP completion remains eligible for FAPE through the end of the semester in which the student turns 22, or until they receive a diploma, or until the IEP team determines that they are no longer eligible as a student with a disability. The certificate is not the same as a diploma under IDEA or under ESEA. Or ESSA now, I'm sorry, ESSA. So a certificate of IEP completion does not terminate a student's eligibility for FAPE. We do have some pending guidance that will be released on that hopefully soon. But in the meantime, a student is still eligible for services. You should still be providing services on that student's IEP if they do receive a certificate of IEP completion. Now, we also know that some students will receive a certificate of IEP completion and revoke consent for continued services. That is the student's choice. I absolutely strongly discourage LEAs from encouraging a student to revoke consent after receiving a certificate of IEP completion. But the point here is that a certificate of IEP completion does not terminate your eligibility for FAPE.
Thank you, Christy. We do have a couple new questions around e-signatures and using DocuSign for consent, and if the PWN process is still required if they are obtaining electronic signature from parents.
No, the PWN process is not required if you are obtaining an electronic signature. If you are obtaining a signature that is on the form and that is being uploaded in accordance with like your normal process, you do not need to also document a PWN. In most instances, I would also say that if you are documenting the consent in another way, you may not be required to obtain a PWN or to provide a PWN in that instance. We would just encourage you to do it to make sure that you're thoroughly documenting the impacts of the documents that you're receiving from parents. So if you are using DocuSign, if you are using an electronic signature format, you're not required to get a PWN or to issue a PWN.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Is there language that you should put in the PWN or in the notes if the IEP team is creating a new IEP and the eligibility is out of compliance? That is a really good question. I would say that you should document in the PWN that a student's eligibility is the student continues to be eligible until you determine that they are not eligible. So I would say that you acknowledge in a PWN that the IEP team has developed a new IEP or has completed the annual review of the IEP, and it like acknowledges that the student remains eligible until a reevaluation can be completed, if that makes sense. We also got a question about what the effect of receiving written consent via a picture. So in that instance, that's what I'm saying is if you are receiving parent consent through like a non-conventional way, it is just in your best interest to be documenting the effect of that consent through a PWN. So you can say we received consent from the parent through a picture emailed on X date. The LEA, and then describe how the LEA will move forward based on that consent. So we will be conducting the initial evaluation. Pretty simple. Really just ensuring that you are documenting what you are doing for students and the effects of consents that are being provided to you.
Christy, just one follow-up to that. Should LEAs be noting how the student will be evaluated, whether if they are waiting for in-person time or whether the student will be assessed virtually? Should that also be outlined in the PWN?
Yeah, I think that would best serve LEAs to make sure that you're including in your PWNs how you will be conducting whatever activity you are proposing or refusing to conduct. So especially during COVID, just to make sure that you are providing appropriate notice to parents of what the plan is.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Christy. I know folks had a lot of questions, and I think we've answered the bulk of them. I did see one question about how to sign up for the Secondary Transition 101 series, and you will be able to access this PowerPoint presentation, and the link is included within the presentation, the PDF version. You'll be able to go and sign up directly from the link embedded in the presentation for the Secondary Transition 101 training.
We also received a note from OSSE's manager for Medicaid recovery that for Medicaid recovery purposes, for Medicaid reimbursement purposes, the LEA needs to be able to indicate the mode that the evaluation was completed in. So make sure that you are documenting whether an evaluation or assessments will be conducted in person or virtually.
Thank you so much for that, Yvonne and Christy, for pointing that out for our LEAs. I do want to say thank you to everyone who joined our session today, and to remind you that our next session, our next webinar will be February 17th from 10 to 11. And if you want to share this link with other professionals that you believe, whether within your LEA, should join the next webinar, feel free to do so. I also want to bring to your attention that we have an appendix here outlining not only the role of the POC, the coordination that's needed, but our contact information from our OSSE team here for pretty much everything that you may need in terms of special education support. We have also added, because there have been some questions around data support and who your LEA's data liaison is, our DAR liaison. We have included a link here. Everyone who presented today, their information is here, as well as other offices that can support you with any special education questions or concerns that you may have. Again, thank you everyone for attending this session, and we hope to see you next month.